Welcome to the Longevity Protocol with Dr. Cristina Bosch and Dr. John A. Robinson. We'll be your guides to uncovering the secrets to optimal health, better sex, and happiness. From debunking aging myths to exploring the science behind what it means to live the Longevity Protocol, we'll dive into a wide range of topics. So, get ready for an exhilarating journey in what it means to live well and feel your very best at any age.
Hi.
This is a near and dear to my heart episode. ThyroZone Thyroid Protocol, a proven protocol to really help with your thyroid health and to really help with your thyroid health. And so I think for both of us, this is pretty near and dear.
Oh, yeah.
This is like one of our first babies, I would say, bringing this all together, figuring this out earlier in our career, and putting together what is really a world-class approach to thyroid health. And I think we've been sort of on the cutting edge of all of that for a lot of years, because we've been doing it, this particular protocol in some form, and we've been practicing 18 years. We could maybe say 17 years of doing this protocol. After we develop it, it's been in development. I'm constantly kind of fine-tuning and tweaking it.
I mean, that's what keeps it cutting edge, right? We
Right.
tweak as, although,
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
the core is
The core is the same, and it has been for a long time. And the reason too is because the core of what we discovered was the same. I always say, I think we're pretty good at coming up with protocols and systems, but we're also pretty good at identifying historically what has been effective, and then taking what other really giants in the medical field have already done, and putting it all together into something that's usable for the practitioner and very usable and effective for the patient. Yeah.
And the thyroid is just so rewarding to work with because it's so responsive. I mean, it pretty easily gives us a yay or a nay. Like, yes, this is a good idea. Keep doing it. Nay, it's not. And thankfully, our patients have just been so willing to open their mind and move away from what they had been told previously, so that we've nailed it down and just made a beautiful program.
Yeah, and so there is a book, ThyroZone, Real Solutions for Better Health and Better Living. That's our second book, and where we really kind of brought it down into a usable handbook.
Yeah.
But even in the first book, The Hormone Zone, that's where there's a whole lot of real technical information. And that's where I think we really discovered what was going on.
Yeah, with all the research supporting it. I mean, just...
And, and early on, just to kind of give everybody an understanding of the history of this, I came across a guy named Dr. John Lowe, God rest his soul. And he was a chiropractor, just a brilliant doctor. And he was a mathematician and statistician.
And a great teacher.
And he wrote a 1,000-page tome, a huge textbook called The Metabolic Treatment of Fibromyalgia. And that's where I learned a lot of the technical aspects, because he went and did a lot of the heavy lifting in the history of thyroid treatment and what doctors used to do, all the way fast forward to what they have been doing really kind of consistently since about the 1980s in a way that hasn't helped patients. And he goes through and sort of dissects all of that in great detail and explains it all. And he relates it actually to fibromyalgia, and how fibromyalgia, really, when you line all the symptoms up of fibromyalgia and you line up all the symptoms of the classic low thyroid, they're pretty much the same thing. And that historically, there wasn't fibromyalgia. It was just called low thyroid. And then they'd give thyroid hormone to the patient, and then they would get better. If they came and said, I had the muscle aches and the pains and the things that are specific, the depression and all the things that are specific, that we would now say, well, that's fibro. It was just low thyroid, and they would treat it relatively effectively. But right around in the 1980s, it used to be called fibromyositis. Then they changed the name to fibromyalgia. Right at the same time, they started using a certain thyroid test called the TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone test, TSH test. And right at that same time, when they started using the TSH, what likely was happening is that they were observing a patient with low thyroid, but the TSH was normal.
Right.
They would present like that. So they said, well, I guess the thyroid's normal because by God, the TSH says it is. So it's, well, we'll call it, I don't know, fibromyalgia.
Right.
They kind of came up with the term.
And of course, the problem there is they were then not treating as effectively because they weren't even considering thyroid hormone as a therapy.
Yes. And then when it comes to muscle aches and pains and the fatigue and the depression and all those kind of things, I mean, thyroid is just simple and easy and profound.
Yeah.
And usually for a lot of people just is the answer.
Yeah. I mean, I would still say, excuse me, I would still say that in fibromyalgia, it's a hypothyroid patient, usually with some specific trauma.
Yeah.
I often find, and I have seen plenty of papers to support my observations as well. But
yeah, and that was something I think you noticed early on in your career, and I definitely learned that from you. And I think you're right. And the other thing is, interestingly, a fibromyalgia patient will present with a very, very low, like sort of low normal TSH. And it's almost like the body isn't kicking in enough to produce the hormone, even though the TSH looks
it's not broken, normal. It's just malfunctioning.
But it's almost like it almost looks that way all the time in a fibro patient. I've seen that.
Yeah.
So that trauma, because it's true that thyroid will go into a low function with even the whiplash, the trauma to the gland itself, or to any kind of major physical, mental, emotional trauma, like what a lot of these fibro patients would go through, that kind of induces it.
Right.
And it creates it. So let's back up a little bit. That's a little bit about just the history and why we've got involved and Dr. Lowe and what we've learned from that.
Yeah.
And that culminated in creating our protocol. And we can go through that today. So what exactly is this little thyroid gland? I mean, what is this thing? Now you want me to answer? Or are you going to answer?
Okay. I'm just here for the ride.
You're here for the ride. The thyroid gland, a small little butterfly-shaped gland that's in right around the area of our throat, and it secretes thyroid hormone, among other things. Thyroid hormone, it secretes something called calcitonin, which helps to some degree in regulation with our calcium levels and for our bones. There's also on the thyroid something called the parathyroid hormone glands. There's 4 of them, like little buttons that are right around the same location of the thyroid gland, and they're also helping with regulation with calcium.
But the thyroid does not produce TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone.
Correct.
That comes from the brain.
Yeah. So the brain, or the pituitary, secretes this certain hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. It's to stimulate the thyroid to actually produce the thyroid hormone. So when we're looking at the TSH test, as an example, it's not really telling us that much. It's only really, in the end, telling us what's going on with the little cells inside the certain part of the pituitary.
Right.
And that's it. It's not really telling me what's going on with the gland per se.
And it's quite variable. I mean, that's part of the problem with using TSH as the one tool for diagnosing or for assessing thyroid function is that the TSH can fluctuate quite a bit even within a 24-hour period.
Yes.
It's not a reliable tool.
It isn't. I always say it implies towards function one way or another. It might imply that it's low. It might imply that it's high, but it doesn't tell me definitively what's going on, not only with the gland, but what's going on with how that hormone is affecting your body tissues or not.
Right.
So we look at it by saying, how do we measure the body and what's going on with the body? And part of that is just simply asking the patient.
Of course.
An in-depth inventory of their symptoms can really give you, and signs are things that are measurable, that can really give us a good idea.
Yeah. So I may be jumping out of order here, but when I have a patient before me who's, especially if they're an existing thyroid patient, meaning they've already been diagnosed by someone else, I first of all have to re-educate them on the process of assessing their thyroid health. Teach them that the TSH is not the way to assess the thyroid. I always emphasize the idea that there's 3 things that we should be looking at. Number 1 is going to be subjective, right? What is the patient themselves reporting? What is the symptom what is the symptom inventory, like you just said? What are the signs that the body is presenting with? Number 2 would be blood work. the TSH is part of that, but so are all these other things that we test that we'll talk about. And then I always suggest that there be some form of an alternative test. In our case, it's the ThyroFlex.
Yes. Well, and I want to get into that. That's
Yeah.
certainly that's a certain unique part of our protocol. But let's talk a little bit about the symptoms. So people that are listening, like what does it mean? How is it usually going to present? Maybe somebody out there right now is suffering with this and they didn't realize.
Well, I mean, I blame everything on the thyroid first, but I guess that's what we do. So, what's that? You have a hammer, everything is a nail kind of a thing.
Sure.
But I think it's a safe place to start.
It really is, because they call the thyroid the great pretender. It winds up being very often many, many things, because it has so many symptoms.
Yes.
And the reason is because that thyroid hormone that comes out of the gland, T4, T3, that hormone is affecting your cells. Every single cell in your body, head to toe, inside and out, is affected in some way and influenced in some way by thyroid hormone.
Yeah, it's the master of metabolism. It's the guy in charge. So
Yeah.
if anything is starting to function suboptimally, which is hopefully where we start, right? We prefer it to be like, oh, things are just starting to not work quite as well, versus like, I'm like full blown hypothyroid or hyper, but usually we're talking about hypothyroid, low functioning thyroid. No, start thinking about it if you're already just not feeling awesome.
So
specifically symptoms, go.
Fatigue. I mean, just
fatigue.
Right, and debilitating fatigue. Fatigue is defined as I rested and I still am fatigued. If you or say, well, I'm tired, and then you get a good night's sleep, or you just rest and you go, then I wake up refreshed, that's not fatigue. So fatigue is just this sort of ongoing tiredness that doesn't relieve itself at all.
Keep in mind, having that degree of fatigue doesn't always interrupt a person's function, though.
Well,
and that's an important thing.
People learn to push past all kinds of things.
So if someone's thinking like, oh, no, I mean, I do everything that I need to do. Well, yeah, but if you also have that like nagging feel like, you're walking through molasses. I've heard people describe it like it's like everything is effort. That's something.
That's fatigue, and it's pointing maybe towards thyroid.
Or at least in part.
Feeling cold. One of the first physical exams I do with my patient is I shake their hand. And a lot of times people just have really cold hands. Now they could be sitting, in the middle of the summer and then they're sitting in the air conditioning and they're just cold. But it really can give you a pretty good indication and a lead in to say, hey, are you always cold? Yeah, my hands and my feet are always cold. Doesn't matter.
I never leave home without a sweater, or everyone around me is hot and I'm freezing.
And I'm cold. Yeah. It's almost what we call pathognomonic. It's a really striking symptom.
It's a telltale.
It's a telltale sign that it likely is thyroid, because the metabolism is low and it's almost like you become like a reptile.
You're shutting down.
You're shutting down.
I hate that.
Yeah.
But then again, I'm hypothyroid. So, it's like.
Yes. And you take thyroid hormone and it really helps. And when you don't take it, I mean, you can definitely tell the difference.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty common. Constipation.
Oh, yes. And constipation is defined as not having, do I word that in the positive? I don't know. Not having at least one bowel movement per day. And it should be easy enough to pass. It should not be with strain and it should not be with trauma. That's so important. When I first started, I've probably said this story before, but when I first started, I would say to the patient, are you constipated? No. Great. Then I started to learn that people would say they're not constipated and they were having like one bowel movement a week. I'm like, but that's how it's always been. So why would they think that that's a symptom? Yes, you have to have a poop every day.
Amen.
I also hate that.
Look, when the thyroid is low, everything's not working well. Again, we said it affects every single cell. And so the motility or the movement of the intestines and how things are moving through the intestines is going to be affected.
You're slow.
Everything's
you're cold.
slow.
You're sluggish. Your body.
Right. And then the other classic thing would be some type of mood disorder. Whether that's just moodiness a little bit, it could be full-blown depression. It even could be anxiety. Here's the other big one that I think people always relate to, and that would be weight gain. But here's the thing about weight gain that I think people need to understand when it comes to low thyroid. 1/3 of all low thyroid patients are not overweight.
Right.
That's not what they're dealing with. They're hypometabolic. A lot of times, you need energy to sleep. That's why I always say, and also you need energy in order to sort of absorb nutrients. So a lot of times low thyroid patients just turn into like, they're really skinny.
Yeah.
They're just low,
But they're not nourished.
They're not,
they don't have vitality.
Yes. Yeah. But they're thin.
Yeah.
So they're still low metabolic. Their metabolism is actually low, even though they're thin.
And I will say that a thyroid patient, even when they're thin, has changes in the face and in the neck that you can see. So you know how you said one of the first things you do, you're shaking a person's hand, you're feeling whether they're cold. That's one of the first tests. Obviously, we see them walking down the hall.
Yep.
That's another thing. Slow reflexes, they don't have as much balance. But one of the places that I find so impressive with patients is the way their face structure changes. You know, there's a bogginess and there's a droopiness to the eyes, to the eyelids, to the under eye area. There's almost like a swelling, again, that boggy droopiness around the jaw. You'll notice in the clavicles, there's like a fullness in the neck, in the throat, in the clavicles. Those are things that I can observe in a patient immediately, even if they are not overweight.
Yes. Sometimes the eyes will even bulge in some way. We call that exophthalmos.
That's like where your eyeball feels like it's like popping out.
And exophthalmos is really specific.
Yes.
And I would say most people probably don't present with full-blown exophthalmos, but there is still, like to your point, there's a bogginess in the face. There's a slight protrusion of the eyes, all of which it's very correctable once they get on.
Pretty fast too.
It's amazing.
Thyroid's fast.
Part of what's going on too, when you say that, that's thyroid hormone helps you to put water in the right compartment. It helps to take it out of the tissues and put it properly into the cell. And when you don't have enough thyroid hormone, then everything just sort of leaks out.
Right.
And that's part of the swelling that people are getting.
And again, to that point, metabolism. If a cell is dehydrated, then metabolism is impaired. So I often will give the analogy of trying to start a fire in the absence of oxygen. So the same thing, if you're trying to create energy in the absence of hydration, there's an impairment that goes on there. And this is important because sometimes a person will say, well, I drink plenty of water, but they're not getting hydrated. The cells are not getting hydrated because the thyroid isn't working well.
Another common one, speaking of hydration, that it made me think of Sika. Sika is the fancy word for just dryness. So if
I just blinked, I was like, oh, my eye.
Eye, skin, hair, and vaginal dryness. So patients will come in to us and they might be menopausal. And so, well, I have vaginal dryness, and we automatically sort of think estrogen, and that's true. But a lot of times it's thyroid, especially let's say they're not full-blown menopausal, but they're having just dryness across the board. It could be thyroid. Now, that can be just sometimes go drink some water and get essential fatty acids, take a fish oil. And those things we would still say nonetheless. But low thyroid is pretty common for that.
And dryness is part of the constipation as well.
Yeah.
It's almost like the stool is so void of moisture, it can't travel through the tube.
Yeah, exactly. So,
those are symptoms.
Those are symptoms.
You said hair, skin dryness,
nails.
acne, nails, brittle nails. They don't grow well. Sometimes they peel. The loss of the lateral 1/3 of the eyebrow. So a lot of hair thinning, dry, lackluster. That's how you say that, right? Lackluster.
Yeah, lackluster.
Sounded funny. It's messed up.
It's a little messed up. And it's common. It's common.
Oh, yes.
You are not alone. There are a lot of patients who are dealing with this. It is far more common in women. We did a podcast episode on the birth control pill. We've talked about the birth control many, many times. And it could be that the birth control pill is in part causing some of the problems that we're actually seeing with the thyroid. So you got to be aware of what else is going on with that patient when you're trying to diagnose low thyroid.
Well, and rarely do these imbalances happen in a vacuum.
Right.
We had talked about the idea of vaginal dryness and estrogen and fish oils and dehydration. And again, the thyroid, like I had said, it's the master of metabolism, but it's working in conjunction with the other aspects of metabolism, which we outline in great detail in our protocol and in our books, that thyroid is then going to impact your cortisol, your estrogen, your testosterone, and vice versa. If you're having ovarian suppression and this is, let's say, due to birth control, well, that's putting a bigger burden on the thyroid to pick up the slack for the ovaries not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
There's a synergy that goes on with all of these. That's actually when we say the hormone zone, we are talking about that synergy between a lot of the major systems, certainly including thyroid and how that affects sex hormones and vice versa. I was going to say too that we see low thyroid, and mostly what we're talking about right now have been the symptoms of low thyroid, low thyroid. It's 8 to 10 times more common in women than it is in men. It's just far more common. And then you got to ask the question, well, why? Why is it happening more in women? Well, back to this idea of the birth control pill as being one thing. It's very, very common. Millions of women are using the birth control pill or have used it at one point in their lives that could be exacerbating nutrient deficiencies that further exacerbates leading into low thyroid. One of the key nutrients would be iodine.
Right.
And that is a major deficiency. And we have been dealing with it. It's amazing how many years we have been talking about this.
I used to test iodine, urine analysis all the time when I first started. And it's an out-of-pocket test. It's not terribly expensive, but still it's an out-of-pocket test. I never had a person with normal iodine.
Yeah.
And I would check it when I was replacing the iodine. I would recheck it in X amount of time, whatever. It would be a while. And I was like, why am I spending money? Why am I asking people to spend money on this when it's such a safe replacement?
Yeah, that's a good point. I did the same thing to some degree. I know you did a lot of it. The good thing about iodine that it has a mechanism in it. In the body has a mechanism in order to dump out
excess.
Iodine. And frankly, you need a lot. We're constantly processing it, but there are mechanisms in the system to allow us to balance that out.
Right.
So, you got to take a lot of iodine to really make it potentially a problem.
Right. And there are so many problems with iodine deficiency, or so many reasons why we have iodine deficiency. One of the ones that I feel like you were just talking about this the other day to someone. Oh yeah, you were. Why are we deficient in iodine? Well, iodine used to be used in breads.
Yeah, as a dough conditioner.
And that's been taken out and it was replaced with bromide.
Yes.
And that was one of the primary places that Americans were getting their iodine, because we're not a big sea vegetable society, not here. And when you see it in multi-nutrients that people take, they're like, oh, I get it in my supplements. In microgram dose, I mean, like, you're not touching it, and we give milligram amounts.
Right. And yeah, you mentioned something I think is very important. Yeah, sea vegetables. So, seaweed and these types of things have all kinds of iodine in it. People are just not really ingesting those things too much.
No, I mean, our kids eat that.
Remember when I used to do that?
What?
Remember when I got seaweed, powdered seaweed,
so gross,
and I would put it into a protein drink. I've done all kinds of crazy things.
I tell patients that all the time. I'm like, Dr. Robinson is so freaking disciplined. You also are a man of extremes. Like, you go like from 0 to 60. I'm more of like a cruise at 50 with the roof down kind of girl,
Yeah, I'm experimenting.
That powder smelled like peers.
Yeah. It
smelled like you were licking a hot baked pear. It was so gross.
Yeah, I just take a pill now. So it's
eat seaweed like the girls do.
Course,
I mean, my kids eat that.
We do that, but
the girls eat that like
all the time. It's a great snack. What's interesting about the seaweed, since we're talking about when you get high quality seaweed, this was harvested in Washington, and they put it in that powder form. It's not just iodine that comes into that, but you actually have small amounts of thyroid hormone. They're just little broken pieces of thyroid hormone that's in it, because thyroid's already a very primitive type of hormone. So it's easy to kind of make it even naturally to some degree. And when it's concentrated into that powder form, you'll get a little bit of that in there. So that was quite stimulating. If
Yeah.
I used too much of it, I'd feel a little jacked up from it. So it was really effective. I mean, it was no joke.
Yeah.
It was medicinal.
That's always the beautiful thing of using food as medicine, right? You get all those, we've talked about this before, you get all those cofactors.
The co-nutrients.
Like that's one of the things with iodine absorption is that you do want that selenium, you want that zinc, you want those other micronutrients and minerals in there so that your body is using it.
Yes.
And so that the thyroid hormone is converting into an active thyroid hormone.
Good point. Look, and for those that are listening, if you're using iodine, you want to use it along with selenium. So where some of the issue can be that you can create a selenium deficiency. So if you're supplementing with iodine, particularly when you get into milligram amounts of iodine, make sure there's selenium in it. And then we have something called Biodine that we use. We've been using that for years and years and years. It already has selenium, it has magnesium in it, it has some Himalayan sea salt. It balances
That's such
out.
a good product.
It's a fantastic, easy product. One a day is usually enough.
The formula's reliable. Yeah. Standards of making it are reliable. The owner is very involved. Like it's just a good product.
And we highly recommend it.
Yeah.
So that was going in a lot of different directions there as we're just sort of answering to this as we go. But that was hypothyroidism.
Yeah.
Then there is hyper.
Oh, sorry. Wait. Before you move on to hyper, I want to just introduce the notion of that subclinical hypothyroidism.
Oh, okay. Yeah, good point.
So, okay.
So subclinical meaning under the radar.
Specifically TSH.
Yes. And so a lot of patients are walking out there with a subclinical hypolothyroid situation that the TSH might be quote unquote normal. It might not be normal to us because we look at the range a little differently, but let's say it's somewhat normal, but you still present with all the signs and symptoms of low thyroid. It's very reasonable to move forward with a trial of thyroid hormone to see if it helps. And most of the time it does.
You have to demand your T4 and T3, and I would say your antibodies to be checked.
Yes.
So you can have normal TSH or low normal TSH, which is usually the case, but the T3 and the T4 are maybe even flagged as low, or the T4, which is the more abundant thyroid hormone that's being produced, but it's inactive. That might be okay. Oh, we didn't check the T3. Well, the T3 is that active thyroid hormone. So many times that's the guy that comes in and says, I'm low. Yep. That's how we know. I mean, you use a little bit of thyroid and you can rehab that system, or you just find that you really are on the brink of about being truly hypothyroid, or they're fluctuating, right? Like in and out. Anyway.
So yeah, and you mentioned the antibodies, and we can get into the different types of testing that a patient should do. But if somebody has low thyroid, one of the most common reasons in the United States is to have an autoimmune condition called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So that means the immune system itself is attacking the thyroid gland. That's destroying some of the cells and causing the hypo-low functioning of the gland itself.
And symptoms.
And a lot of symptoms. And often, then now they have an autoimmune situation. So then the immune system is all imbalanced in its own way, causing its own problems, but certainly causing the low thyroid. And it's very common. We see it all the time. And there's certainly ways to go about handling that as well. But that's the symptom, the situations of low thyroid, having an autoimmune situation. And those are all the symptoms for that.
And I have seen where I'm often the one diagnosing the Hashimoto's. They've never had it checked before. And a lot of times, maybe the person's thyroid panel isn't even that remarkable. Okay, it's low functioning, but it's still normal. But the problem with that is that autoimmune diseases often run in clusters. So if you start earlier on in life with Hashimoto's and it never goes treated, there's no addressing the exaggerated immune response, that person will often develop something else later in life. So there is a lot of benefit to truly understanding what your thyroid panel is telling you about your health, because if you can manage the thyroid antibodies now, while you're for the most part feeling okay, you can do a lot for preventing further diseases.
That's a great point, because if you have a normal thyroid panel, but your antibodies are high, a regular doctor almost always will not treat that. They don't think it's worthy treating it. And I really disagree because, to your point, where there is one autoimmune condition, there is often others lurking. Either they're there, you don't see it, or they're getting ready to come.
Or they're getting to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so that's hypothyroid.
So that's hypo, low,
yes.
Hashimoto's.
Got it.
Then there is hyperthyroid, high functioning thyroid. And its autoimmune disease is called Graves' disease. So hyper high function, what happens? Well, you're jacked up.
You have too much
thyroid hormone. You feel anxious. You feel shaky. You have tremors, hand tremors.
Right.
Often high blood pressure, other palpitations and cardiac issues. If you've got full blown Graves' disease and hyperthyroidism, it can be life threatening.
Yeah.
Because of its relationship to the heart.
Cardiac stress.
Yes, it stimulates the heart in a crazy way. They also can get, we were saying before, that exophthalmos, that sort of bug eye kind of look. It's pretty severe. Now we don't usually see that, and the reason that we don't usually see, but you don't see hyper high thyroidism as much as you do hypo in this country, period. But we don't usually see it because if someone is hyper high thyroid, they start having those symptoms. It's cardiac in nature. They'll go to the doctor and they're going to get blasted. They're going to either radiate their thyroid gland. They're going to give them some kind of radiation to take it away. That's pill and otherwise. They will give them antithyroid drugs. They will give them sometimes just surgery. They'll just have surgery because they'll realize there's something going on with the gland.
Surgery to the thyroid gland.
Yeah, they'll just remove part of it or in whole or whatever. Yeah. And their attempt is to normalize the thyroid situation, the thyroid hormone stimulating the body. They want to bring all that down. But what do they usually do? They just overshoot.
Right. And
then they take the patient from hyper high into hypo low. Mm-hmm. It's almost always what happens.
Correct.
So, hyper, we don't usually see it because they had that usually done.
Yeah.
It's emergent, so they don't kind of come into our office because they went to the emergency room and it's just like they just freak out. Meaning the doctors, and they just take it out, or what do they do? So then they come to see us.
So if we have hyperthyroid patients, usually it's because they are now hypothyroid in response to the treatment.
They started off, I was Graves, and but that was 10 years ago. But now I really feel bad. And yes, they started giving me thyroid hormone, synthetic thyroid hormone, and I don't feel any better.
And even in Graves, the immune component, the concept of an autoimmune component, is never addressed.
Yes. Yeah. So that's the symptoms.
Yeah.
And as far as treatment now. So, let's talk about, when we're going to talk about diagnosis. How do we go about diagnosing? So now let's talk a little bit more detail about the labs. So what is a patient going to get with us? They're going to get the TSH number. Mm-hmm. We're going to do that automatic. They're going to have a total T4. T4 is one of the thyroid hormones that come out of the gland.
Right, the most abundant.
Most abundant one. It's the one that's mainly being produced. Then something called free T4, which is an unbound version of that hormone that's free to get into the cells. Then there's something called T3. And so we'll usually check the free T3. T3 is the most important thyroid hormone that we have.
It's the most metabolically active.
Yes. So we have T4. That's tyrosine with 4 little iodines on it. Mm-hmm. And then our body takes and chops one of those iodines off it and makes it activated T3.
Right. So in other words, T4 is supposed to convert into T3. Plus, T3 can also be made directly.
Right. And some of the problems are, one, kind of probably what you were thinking, is the T4 doesn't always conveniently.
It's a massive assumption.
Yes, right. We just, and the conventional doctor says, well, it's going to convert. You need iodine and selenium, particularly need zinc, in order to allow that conversion of T4 into T3. So that's one potential problem. Sometimes the active T3 that may be there isn't actually getting absorbed by the cell. And that's called thyroid hormone resistance. Right. And so back to good old Dr. John Lowe we were talking about earlier, that was in part what he really, really brought forward and brought an awareness to that fibromyalgia and other situations like that are thyroid hormone resistance. Their thyroid labs look normal, but the body is at the cellular level is not absorbing the thyroid hormone that's there.
Yeah. And this information that you're providing, the reason it's so relevant is because there's so many people out there that are being treated for their hypothyroidism already. And they're like, I'm being treated. This isn't relevant to me. Well, actually, It is, because if you're being treated with just T4 therapy, like most people are, Synthroid.
Absolutely.
Then you are not necessarily aware of how successfully you're converting into the T3 or how successfully that thyroid hormone is being taken into the cell.
Right. And a lot of times, again, we were saying this before, the patients don't even know how good they can feel.
They should feel.
Yeah, right. They don't even really understand. Yeah. It is true that it doesn't often convert. What's called T4 monotherapy, that's usually what you go in, they look at a TSH only. Then you get diagnosed. They put you on a very, very low dose of Synthroid, which is the most common prescription of what's called levothyroxine. It's just the most common brand called Synthroid. And it's T4 monotherapy, meaning it's only T4.
Only T4.
So what we suggest is to add in that T3.
At minimum.
All right, along with the T4. So it's, the T4 along, that'll to some degree get converted, particularly with our patients, because we'll give them the nutrients to allow them to do that, and then give them active T3 within the same formula.
Right.
And they've done studies with this. It's very clear that patients feel better when they receive T3 aside from just T4 monotherapy.
And the most common T3 for those out there, it's going to be Cytomel or leothyroxine.
Yes. Yeah, liothyronine, and which is Cytomel, which is the most common brand of that. Yeah, that's now we don't, I
said Leo. All right.
Tomato. I don't know. Anyway, the T3 stuff, it's called Cytomel. But we don't usually prescribe that. We do, but we usually prescribe Armour Thyroid, or what's called,
which is the brand.
The brand Armour. It's desiccated thyroid.
Because there are other ones, and there have been other ones, but
yes,
desiccated thyroid.
Desiccated means dried up, ground up, dried up thyroid gland coming from usually porcine or pig.
Right. Which I like to say is like using food as medicine.
Yes.
It's basically organ meat replacement.
Yeah. And here's why, because you were talking about cofactors. Armour Thyroid contains T4, active T3, T2, T1, T0, and something called calcitonin that we mentioned before. All of that in very, very small amounts are found inside the T4 and the T3. That's all regulated. We know what's in that. But all those other little sort of cofactors, it's all there because it's the natural gland from an animal. So it winds up being a synergistic 1 + 1 = 3. It's more than the sum of its parts. And patients just do better on it. Always, no. There's no always in medicine.
No always.
But generally speaking, they're going to do better on that.
I would say traditionally that is 1,000%
Yeah, and so we'll usually take them off their Synthroid, put them on this Armour, and then we go through a process of titrating or increasing, regulating the dose to where
oh my God, that's probably one of the biggest issues.
Yeah.
How many times have I seen a patient that's been on the same dose of thyroid for 20 years? I'm like, how's that possible?
Yeah.
You know how many things have happened in your life? How many biochemical changes? How many physiologic changes? How many weight fluctuations? Like how many things that should have, in theory at least, affected how much thyroid your body is needing?
Because they're getting the TSH test done, and all the TSH test is, remember, it's coming from the pituitary cells. So the thyroid hormone floats up to the pituitary cells and tells the pituitary cells only there's plenty of thyroid.
Right. I'm doing my job.
It's there. So, but it has nothing to do with the signals that are going on with the rest of the body.
Receiving.
It would be great if it did. I would love that it did.
Yeah,
but
it doesn't.
Easy. Yeah,
but that's not how it goes.
It's not how it works.
Right.
Not generally speaking.
So again, diagnosis, we're checking TSH, T4, T3.
Yeah, and here's one final thing I wanted to say. We check something called reverse T3. So regular T3, it kind of floats through the blood and it comes up to the cell and it stimulates the cell. It increases the metabolic rate inside the cell. Reverse T3, it's called an enantiomer. It's a reverse mirror image of the molecule. So reverse T3 comes up to the cell and it doesn't stimulate the metabolic rate. It actually lowers metabolic rate inside the cell, whatever cell we're talking about. And so reverse T3 lowers metabolic rate.
Right.
And so if somebody already has kind of low T3 They're not a good converter of T4 into T3 because they're not being properly supported nutritionally. And they're only taking T4 monotherapy. And then their reverse T3 is super high. Their metabolic rate is
super slow.
Their whole regimen of what they're doing isn't working.
Right.
And why does reverse T3 go up? Stress. Cortisol makes reverse T3 go up. One of the most common things actually is with all these people on Ozempic and semaglutide and all of that.
Right.
In calorie deprivation, it makes stress in the body. When you have all of that stress, it makes cortisol go up. When cortisol goes up, reverse T3 goes up and lowers the metabolic rate. If you're not eating enough calories, your body goes, oh, wait a second,
Yeah.
I want to help you to survive.
Yeah.
So it increases the cortisol to increase the reverse T3. And now your metabolic rate goes down so you can live.
Yeah, that's so important because a lot of times I say to the person, well, the reverse T3 is related to stress. I don't have any stress. I'm like, the person has a particularly stressless life, which happens.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
It's not a unicorn. There's actually a lot of people out there who can self-report
Well, they're
that.
meaning mental, emotional
And that's
stress.
what I have to tell them. I'm like, okay, so now I will often say nutrient deficiency.
Yes, that is a
just
stress
to really,
to the
because if
system.
you are having nutrient deficiency, that is a stress on the body.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
They never look at it that way. Yeah. The word stress, we automatically assume it means mental, emotional.
Right.
Okay, so that's all of the various labs that's helping us with diagnosis.
That's just blood work.
That's just blood work.
Yeah.
And it's also the way we're looking at the ranges.
Correct. I mean, the way we are assessing what the meaning of those labs are is extremely important because you can have 5 different people looking at the same lab and they go, I mean, we've had a lot of situations in the past where the doctor for something else will tell the patient, you got to lower your thyroid, your TSH is low. But the T4 and the T3 are super low. Like that makes no sense. You can't just look at it that way.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So what else?
Symptoms. We talked about.
Talked about the symptoms. We
so
talked about
patient
sort of part of the diagnosis. Oh, back to the range, excuse me. So with the range on the labs, we're looking for the usually the top end of the range. We're looking to optimize.
High normal.
Yeah, we don't want to have, low normal situations where it's still in the range, but for us, we would say that is optimal.
I mean, remember I had said that lab values change a lot. So if you're on the low end of normal, you could be dipping in and out of normal. And that's important because you will be symptomatic. Yes.
And so lab analysis, that's part of our unique approach. And then the ThyroFlex. So let's take a minute to talk about that. This is a particular test that was invented by a naturopathic doctor. I'm forgetting his name at the moment. And Dr. Daryl Turner, who's a PhD and inventor. And this particular test is measuring the reflex speed of it's called the brachioradialis. It's just right here as the wrist moves. Yeah, this part of your arm. And all of your reflexes are associated with thyroid function. We've known this for 100 years. It's called Waltman's sign. So we bang on a reflex and the reflex goes slow.
Right. Like in the olden days, because I don't know who still does that. They hit you on the knee. And,
Yes. And classically it was always the Achilles tendon reflex. And you would look to see how slow the reflex moved. If it moved up, but then it relaxed slowly, they would be able to diagnose low thyroid. And they used to do it forever, and they would be able to do that.
Great.
Doctors were actually touching the patient, observing the patient.
And that's still true. The human body did not unevolve that reflex.
So what we're doing is using the ThyroFlex test, which is measuring to the millisecond how fast that reflex is moving with technology.
Right. So we're getting an exact quantitative reading.
Right. Taking an old test and just, bringing it into the 21st century with technology. And then, yes, being able to get that real specific number, because what happens with the reflex test is using a reflex hammer, you can't see it. You try, you can't remember what happened exactly 3 months before, but we can track this very accurately with the ThyroFlex. So we look at that. So a patient can come in with normal labs, and then we check their ThyroFlex test and we line up all the signs and symptoms. And we go, you're low thyroid.
I mean, you're suffering for no reason.
Right. So we will very confidently then, I would almost say intrepidly, give them thyroid hormone that they never got before. Now they're finally on thyroid hormone. And then we'll use the ThyroFlex test to figure out where their dose should be.
Yeah.
And now here's what's unique about what we do. Our dose tends to be quote unquote higher. And I use that word loosely because I don't think it's higher.
I don't either.
It's just
obviously I don't.
What it should be, but it is higher than normal of what is average that would be given. And it usually makes it look like on paper, it looks like on the thyroid testing, the TSH particularly, it looks like you're on too much.
Right.
And you
TSH
aren't.
suppression.
The TSH goes down. When the TSH is low, they think you're high thyroid. The TSH is opposite of what you think. So our patients, almost 90% of my patients have a suppressed TSH. It quote unquote looks like they're on too much thyroid. They feel great. We're checking their ThyroFlex test. We're obviously talking to them about the possibility of overstimulation. We're checking their EKG.
We're monitoring
heart function. And 18 years of doing this.
No, I mean, what is the guy from the hair club for men? Like, I'm also a patient. Like, I'm also a patient. I feel very confident in the fact that if you are truly listening to the patient, educating the patient on what does it look like if it's too much
Well, what
medicine.
does it look like when you're on too much? Kind of back to that hyperthyroid thing.
Yeah. I mean, I always say it feels like you're amped up on caffeine because it's a very, I would say that after years of listening to patients and myself experiencing it, it's a very clear feeling of being chemically affected. It's not like this subtle. It's, you have shortness. You can have, they don't necessarily all present shortness of breath, palpitations, racing heart, spontaneous like diarrhea. Maybe you're sweating. There's this like nervousness, but there's no cause for the nervousness. It's
not going away.
And it doesn't go away. It's a very uncomfortable chemical influence.
So you have to look out for those things. And what we find too, patients that are nutrient deficient, if they have other hormonal imbalances, if they don't have any cardiovascular fitness, those are the ones that'll tend to maybe get a little overstimulated with how we do this. But even then, it doesn't matter because we just figure it out and we lower the dose.
Right. And also, again, we will treat that thyroid hormone resistance. Sometimes the dose is right, but it's not getting into the cell.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's very simple, but that doesn't mean it's always easy.
Yeah. One other thing that we could mention here in closing too, back to the Hashimoto's that we will often see. That's very common in what we treat. We use something called LDN or low dose naltrexone. And that has been a really, really profound tool and effective for us when we added that into the protocol years ago. It really does help with controlling the antibodies, and not just for Hashimoto's, but many, many other autoimmune conditions.
Yeah, it's a game changer.
So I would definitely encourage people to explore ldnresearchtrust.org. ldnresearchtrust.org. And in fact, I did a talk, what was that, way back in 2015? I don't know. It was a while ago. And using LDN and how we were using that in our office and our observations and our improvements we saw with that. But they use it for traumatic brain injury and all. Bariatric settings for weight loss. There's certain medications that PTSD. It's a fantastic medication at low doses, but it definitely helps to balance out the immune system. So that's really the whole protocol.
I mean, the thyroid is so fun to work with. It's like I said, it's a very responsive gland. It's so fulfilling to teach patients how to truly understand their thyroid and their metabolism, and to make people realize how much better they can be feeling, how wonderful they can be feeling. I think my closing comment is, don't settle for mediocrity, because usually your thyroid's involved.
Yes. And, and I will say on that too, you can find practitioners that understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, functional.
I will still say that is hard to find. It's difficult. I wish there was more that really, really understood, because even functional medicine doctors and other naturopathic doctors don't exactly always do it the way we do it. They get close to it, but they never really kind of push the envelope just quite enough to get to the patient in relief.
But there's a lot patients can do for themselves. Yes. We outline it in the book. I mean, you can read it, you can learn, you can make steps on your own. You can ask your doctor specific questions.
Be your own advocate. Yeah.
And of course you can always just reach out to us.
Yes.
My I think so cute way of saying, humility aside, we're freaking good at this. Like
this one, I've put some effort into this one for sure.
Top doc.
Yeah. When it comes to thyroid and how we're doing it, it makes sense to us, and we've had a lot of great success. And what you had said earlier to patients, I mean, they've really been fantastic with allowing us to work with them.
Yeah.
And
learn.
learning from them through this process over the years that it now inevitably helps other people.
That's right. Yeah. So thank you to you.
Are you looking and wanting to hear more? Do you want others to benefit from this great content? If you want to ask us a question, please like, subscribe, and share. Comment. You can find links to all of our social media channels and all of our featured articles, basically everything on our our link tree called Longevity Protocol Pod. If you want a little bit more about our personal lives, be sure to follow us on Instagram at the Sex Docs. Here's where you can comment. You can ask questions that we'll directly address in our videos. Be sure to subscribe to our Substack, where there's far more information about the protocols, the thyroid protocol, what we discussed today, things on longevity and health. And finally, if you're ready to make a change in your health and you want to see us as a new patient in Scottsdale, Arizona, please inquire through our private practice website, hormone-zone.com.